The world worshipped Elvis Presley as the ultimate symbol of freedom. To Priscilla, he was an unyielding authority figure. That 14-year-old girl never walked into a glamorous romance. She became the subject of a severe psychological operation. Graceland was never a royal castle. It was a highly restrictive environment with no exit. Inside, Priscilla was denied the right to be a regular partner. She was stripped of her identity, heavily influenced and heavily managed daily to become a compliant, accommodating figure built to serve the twisting demands of the king. That blinding wedding of the century was no triumph. It was a structural arrangement, a flawless agreement, a deeply troubling dynamic hidden in plain sight. This elaborate cover-up was merely the final padlock on a trap, set 8 years earlier. The psychological enclosure that consumed Priscilla began with a meticulously calculated arrangement in West Germany in 1959. Pop culture romanticizes their meeting as a charming fairy tale, but the reality was a textbook case of systematic influence. At the center was not a love-struck musician, but an intensely controlling figure utilizing a highly organized network to secure a vulnerable target. Stationed overseas in the Army, a strategic PR maneuver engineered by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis was removed from his controlled Hollywood ecosystem. Bored, highly dependent on military-issued energy supplements, and operating with unchecked extreme entitlement, he relied on his entourage, the Memphis Mafia, to maintain his morale. This group essentially ran a continuous scouting operation, searching local establishments to find compliant young companions for their employer. It was within this highly selective social circle that 14-year-old Priscilla Beaulieu was identified. As the geographically displaced stepdaughter of an Air Force captain, she was conditioned to respect authority and uniquely vulnerable to the blinding proximity of power. A middleman for the Presley entourage did not invite her to meet a 24-year-old man out of innocent hospitality. He identified an individual that perfectly fit his employer's specific profile and initiated the introduction process. When Priscilla was brought to Elvis's rented house off base, the power dynamic was not merely imbalanced. It was an absolute chasm. She was a middle school student sitting in the private residence of the most famous, wealthy, and powerful entertainer on the planet, surrounded by his adult management team. Highly influential figures at this level of fame do not need to use physical force. Their mere presence exerts a gravitational pull that disables critical thinking. During their initial interactions, Elvis deployed a classic manipulation tactic, the performance of vulnerability. Instead of acting like a global superstar, he sat at a piano, played melancholic songs, and lamented his homesickness and the recent death of his mother. He positioned himself not as a powerful adult male, but as a wounded, sensitive boy who desperately needed the understanding of a young, innocent individual. He placed the emotional burden of the most famous man in the world squarely onto the shoulders of a 14-year-old. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, instantly manufacturing an intense emotional dependency and making Priscilla feel uniquely valued and essential to his survival. However, extracting a youth from a military family requires bypassing the primary line of defense, the parents. Captain Paul Beaulieu and his wife Anne were initially alarmed. They were conventional protective parents who immediately recognized the inherent danger of a 24-year-old celebrity showing interest in their teenage daughter. They instituted curfews, demanded explanations, and explicitly told Priscilla that the relationship was inappropriate. In a normal civilian scenario, this parental blockade would effectively end the interaction. But Elvis did not operate in a normal civilian scenario. He recognized the parental resistance not as a deterrent, but as a tactical obstacle that required a specific psychological workaround. Elvis understood the psychology of a career military officer. He knew that Captain Beaulieu operated within a strict hierarchy of respect, order, and chain of command. To dismantle the father's defenses, Elvis weaponized his own military uniform and his Southern working-class manners. He did not send representatives. He arrived at the Beaulieu household in person, dressed in full military regalia, radiating politeness. He addressed the captain exclusively as Sir. He spoke softly, looked them in the eye, and delivered a heavily rehearsed monologue about his honorable intentions. He assured them that he was merely a lonely soldier looking for wholesome company, explicitly promising that he would never cross any professional or social boundaries. He leveraged his fame as a blinding light that temporarily paralyzed their parental instincts. It is a terrifying testament to the power of celebrity that a seasoned Air Force captain could look at a global superstar asking to integrate his daughter into a highly demanding late-night schedule, and overcome by the sheer surrealism of the request and the flawless execution of the performance, say yes. Instead of earning genuine trust, Elvis successfully hacked their cognitive dissonance. He secured their ongoing approval with his polite compliance, effectively removing the only shield standing between his target and his unquestioned authority. Once the parents were convinced the systematic separation of the individual began, the process of complete environmental immersion accelerated rapidly. Elvis introduced Priscilla to his nocturnal, highly demanding lifestyle. A young individual who should have been focused on typical daily routines was instead being immersed in a grueling nocturnal routine, navigating late-night gatherings with seasoned industry veterans, absorbing a reality that was entirely divorced from a normal trajectory. He began to reshape her public presentation, expressing a preference for a sophisticated aesthetic that actively mirrored his own entourage. He was testing the perimeter of her compliance and finding no resistance. But this rapid transformation did not go unnoticed by the only people remaining in Priscilla's life who possessed an objective baseline of reality: her childhood friends and peers. Adolescents rely heavily on their peer groups for reality checks and social anchoring. Her friends on the military base saw the chilling physical and behavioral changes. They saw the dark circles under her eyes from extreme sleep deprivation. They saw a former peer arriving at their daily activities exhibiting a drastically altered, polished look suited for a different world. They noticed her sudden, intense secrecy, her withdrawal from normal social activities, and her complete absorption into an adult world she could not possibly comprehend. When these friends attempted to intervene, when they started asking difficult questions and trying to pull Priscilla back into the safety of her actual social circle, they triggered the inner circle's defense mechanisms. The Memphis Mafia was not just a group of friends. They were a highly organized security apparatus trained to eliminate threats to the Elvis brand. A group of concerned peers was categorized as a severe operational security risk. The entourage moved swiftly to sever these final tethers to reality through an active, aggressive campaign of social exclusion and isolation. When Priscilla's friends attempted to call the Beaulieu household, the calls were intercepted or discouraged. If they tried to approach her in public or near the base, they found themselves physically blocked by grown men in suits who comprised Elvis's security detail. The Memphis Mafia utilized their physical size, their proximity to power, and veiled threats to create an impenetrable vacuum around the teenager. They made it explicitly clear to these high school students that their presence was no longer tolerated. The message was delivered with cold efficiency. Stop calling. Stop visiting. Stop asking questions. By aggressively severing her peer connections, the Memphis Mafia ensured Elvis became her sole authority and her only reality. The culmination of this acquisition phase occurred when Elvis's military deployment ended in 1960. He returned to the United States, leaving a 15-year-old Priscilla behind in Germany. This physical separation was not an end to the conditioning. It was a stress test of the psychological tether he had established. He maintained control through late-night phone calls, carefully rationing his attention, keeping her in a state of suspended animation, waiting desperately for the sound of his voice. He was conditioning her to accept a life where her entire existence revolved around his unpredictable schedule and demands. The final logistical maneuver of the arrangement required relocating the youth across international borders, a move fraught with severe operational liabilities. The organization could not simply fly a teenager to Graceland without triggering alarm bells. They needed the explicit documented agreement of the parents. Over the next 2 years, Elvis engaged in a relentless campaign of persuasion, promising Captain Beaulieu that Priscilla would live with his father, Vernon Presley, that she would be enrolled in a premier Catholic school, and that her education and moral upbringing would be strictly supervised. It was a fabricated, sanitized operational plan designed to satisfy the legal and optical requirements of moving a young dependent. In 1962, the Beaulieu family capitulated. The sheer attrition of dealing with a billionaire entity, combined with the relentless pressure from a daughter who had been completely overwhelmed by her situation, broke their resolve. They signed the necessary paperwork, effectively transferring responsibility of their teenage daughter to a rock and roll enterprise. Priscilla packed her bags, left her family, her country, and the last remnants of her childhood behind, and boarded a flight to Memphis. The relocation process was complete. The individual had been successfully identified, conditioned, isolated from all external support systems, and legally exported. She was walking blindly into a heavily fortified compound where the promises made to her parents would evaporate instantly, replaced by a regime of total surveillance and absolute submission. The mythology of American pop culture demands that Graceland be viewed as a sanctuary. To the millions of fans who stood outside the iron gates forged with musical notes, the estate at 3764 Elvis Presley Boulevard was the ultimate manifestation of the American dream. It was a sprawling, opulent southern mansion purchased by a truck driver who had conquered the world. It represented freedom, artistic triumph, and limitless wealth. But architecture is defined not by its facade, but by how it functions for its inhabitants. For a teenager imported from West Germany under the guise of an educational arrangement, Graceland was not a sanctuary. It was a sealed compound. It was a meticulously designed, highly restrictive environment where the mechanisms of psychological pressure were concealed beneath thick pile carpets and custom-made velvet drapes. Once Priscilla Beaulieu crossed the threshold and the gates locked behind her, the theoretical conditioning of the acquisition phase evolved into a harsh physical reality of total control. Graceland functioned as a modern surveillance state, a high-tech environment where privacy was eradicated. Elvis did not merely want a young woman waiting for him in the master suite. He required total, omnipotent control over her physical, spatial, and mental existence. To achieve this, he weaponized his vast wealth to turn a family home into a high-tech observation network. The primary enforcers of this surveillance state were, of course, the Memphis Mafia. They were no longer just the individuals who had found her in Germany. They were now the permanent, omnipresent management staff of her daily life. But human guards, no matter how loyal to the payroll, have blind spots. Elvis eliminated these blind spots through technology. Long before the era of modern smart homes, Graceland was wired for total auditory control. He installed a sophisticated hidden network of intercoms and listening devices throughout the property. The walls of the mansion literally had ears. If Priscilla was in a guest bedroom, if she was in the kitchen, or if she was walking down a hallway, the audio of her environment could be piped directly to the master control panels. Elvis could monitor her conversations when he was in another wing of the house, and more terrifyingly, he could monitor her when he was thousands of miles away on a movie set in Hollywood. This invasive surveillance was not born out of protective concern. It was a deliberate offensive tactic designed to breed extreme, paralyzing worry. Privacy is the fundamental requirement for the development of an independent self. By stripping away her privacy, Elvis was actively preventing the teenager from developing an identity separate from his observation. Priscilla was forced to internalize the chilling reality that she was never truly alone. Every phone call she made was monitored, either by an operative listening on a parallel line or through the house's internal wiring. She could not call her parents in Germany and express fear or doubt, because she knew the words would be intercepted and reported back to the man who held absolute power over her living conditions. She could not keep a diary without the fear of it being found and read by the men who routinely searched the premises. This environment forced her to self-censor every thought, every word, and every action. She was stripped of the last remnants of her autonomy until she existed purely as a subject of his observation. However, controlling the auditory and spatial environment was only the baseline of the operation. The most disturbing aspect of the Graceland enclosure was the systematic total control over Priscilla's physical presence. Elvis did not want a living, breathing, evolving human being. He wanted a bespoke, static construct. He dictated her aesthetic presentation with the clinical, merciless precision of a factory manager overseeing a product line. The teenager who arrived from Germany was methodically overshadowed, replaced by a highly managed image designed to reflect the king's specific, highly unnatural tastes. The physical transformation began with her hair and clothing. She was ordered to dye her natural hair to a jet black shade that perfectly matched his own chemically darkened pompadour. It was then teased, sprayed, and structured into a towering, solid beehive. This was not a fashion choice, it was a physical imposition. The hairstyle required hours of maintenance, effectively anchoring her to the styling chair and dictating how she could move her head and neck. Her wardrobe was entirely curated by him. He favored heavy, mature fabrics, high collars, and restrictive tailoring that actively swallowed her youth. He was dressing a 15-year-old girl in the costumes of a much older, highly stylized woman, creating a jarring disconnect between her biological reality and her forced presentation. But the most psychologically devastating element of this aesthetic micromanagement was the mandate regarding her face. Elvis instituted a rule that was extremely rigid. Priscilla was forbidden from letting him see her bare, unpainted skin. The natural face of a teenager, with all its human imperfections, variations in tone and natural texture, was deemed unacceptable by her controller. She was conditioned to wear a thick, impenetrable mask of heavy foundation, harsh eyeliner, and false eyelashes at all times in his presence. This mandate extended into the darkest hours of the night. The sleep routine imposed upon her exacted a severe psychological and physical toll. Priscilla was required to go to sleep fully made up. If she removed her makeup to wash her face, she had to set an alarm to wake up hours before Elvis opened his eyes. In the dead of night, she would sneak into the bathroom, silently reapply the heavy layers of foundation, glue the false eyelashes back onto her eyelids, and crawl back into the room, lying perfectly still so as not to smudge the illusion. When the king woke up, he was not greeted by a human being, he was greeted by an artificial, flawless facade. To never be allowed to wash your face in your own room is to be subjected to a profound level of depersonalization. It is a daily, relentless reminder that your natural state is inadequate and that your sole purpose is to serve as a visual aesthetic for an individual who demanded absolute perfection. This practice clogged her pores, disrupted her sleep, and fundamentally shattered her self-esteem. She was no longer a person. She was a highly managed presence, terrified that a smeared line of mascara might shatter the precarious peace of the household and trigger a volatile outburst from the man who directed her. The control of her physical form extended beyond the visual and into the olfactory. Smell is the most primal of human senses, deeply linked to memory, biology, and personal identity. Every human being has a unique natural scent. Elvis sought to eradicate even this microscopic level of her individuality. He selected a specific, heavy, mature perfume that he mandated she wear constantly. This was not a romantic gift. It was an aggressive assertion of control. By overriding her natural biological signature with a specific formula he had chosen, he was erasing her presence bit by bit. When she walked into a room, she did not smell like Priscilla. She smelled exactly the way Elvis Presley had instructed her to smell. This is a highly calculated psychological tactic used in extreme behavioral control. It strips the individual of their sensory autonomy, freezing them into an illusion and ensuring that every aspect of their physical being is a testament to the controller's absolute power. Physical confinement was rigorously enforced to ensure that this heavily surveilled, perfectly styled figure never wandered off the pedestal. The public image of Graceland featured a driveway lined with a fleet of custom Cadillacs, Stutzes, and Lincolns. It projected an image of automotive freedom, a core tenet of the American experience. But for Priscilla, this wealth was a mirage. She was explicitly forbidden from driving alone. The keys to the vehicles were controlled by the security staff. She could not simply get behind the wheel of a car, roll down the windows and drive to clear her head, or experience a moment of unsupervised solitude. Every single excursion outside the iron gates of Graceland required an escort from the Memphis Mafia. If she needed to go to the hair salon to maintain the mandated beehive, a guard drove her. If she needed to go to a department store to purchase the specific types of clothing Elvis required, a guard accompanied her. She was chauffeured everywhere, flanked by men in suits who reported her every movement, conversation, and purchase directly back to their employer. The staggering wealth surrounding her was effectively a tool used to guarantee her dependence. She lived in a mansion, ate food prepared by private chefs, and wore expensive clothing, but she could not access a single dollar of that wealth independently. She had no personal bank account. She possessed no cash allowance that she could spend without intense line-by-line scrutiny. The luxury of Graceland was nothing more than a velvet-lined enclosure. By severing her ability to move freely and cutting off any avenue for financial independence, Elvis ensured that physically leaving was a logistical impossibility. She was a dependent, completely reliant on her controller for basic movement, sustenance, and survival. She was trapped in an opulent poverty of agency, surrounded by millions of dollars but unable to buy a bus ticket. Yet physical confinement, auditory surveillance, and aesthetic subjugation are external controls. They can break a spirit, but a human mind in captivity will inevitably quietly search for a way to rebel. A lucid mind might eventually process the situation, recognize the severity of the environment, and attempt to formulate an exit plan. To guarantee absolute, unquestioning submission, Elvis introduced a far more insidious and destructive element into the dynamic: relentless management of her daily rhythm. The true horror of Graceland was not just the locked gates, it was the systematic, exhausting alteration of Priscilla's biological schedule. The king was heavily reliant on a vast array of prescription supplements to manage his schedule. This was not a secret within the industry, but it was rigorously hidden from the public. These prescriptions were supplied by a network of highly paid, deeply unethical private doctors who functioned as the organization's medical enablers. These men abandoned their professional ethics in exchange for the prestige and the exorbitant fees of treating the most famous man on earth. They essentially operated a private supply chain out of their medical bags, providing Elvis with tens of thousands of doses over the course of his career. But Elvis did not just consume these items to manage his own crushing fame and erratic psychology. He brought this intense regimen into the life of the teenager living in his house. The transition from physical control to neurological exhaustion was swift and devastating. He forcefully introduced Priscilla into his daily, extreme routine of powerful energy boosters and heavy sleep aids. The administration of these items was entirely dictated by his manic, unpredictable schedule. Elvis suffered from severe insomnia and operated on a nocturnal timeline, often sleeping all day and waking up at dusk to begin a frenetic, high-energy routine. He demanded that Priscilla match this unnatural biological rhythm perfectly. When he decided it was time to be awake, to go to a rented movie theater at 3 a.m, or to hold court with the Memphis Mafia, A natural teenage sleep cycle was an unacceptable inconvenience. To force her compliance, he handed her powerful stimulants. These items forcefully hijacked her system, keeping her awake, alert, and hyper-focused for days at a time just to serve as an audience for his monologues. Conversely, when the mania subsided and Elvis required silence to sleep, he could not tolerate the idea of Priscilla being awake and unsupervised in the house. He needed her neutralized. To achieve this, he supplied her with heavy, intense sleep aids. These medications are profound depressants. They do not induce natural rest. They enforce an unnatural slumber. She was instructed to swallow these pills so that she would be instantly incapacitated, guaranteeing the absolute silence and stillness he demanded for his own recovery. This was not a case of a young couple sharing a fast-paced lifestyle. This was a highly calculated method of medical mismanagement and profound exhaustion. By chemically altering her rhythm on a daily basis, he kept her in a perpetual state of physiological chaos and groggy compliance. A teenage brain is still in a critical phase of development, highly susceptible to permanent strain from extreme schedules. Bouncing between chemically induced heart-pounding mania and medically enforced paralyzing slumber completely shatters a person's cognitive function. The psychological result of this relentless schedule was the total erosion of her critical thinking skills. A person suffering from severe exhaustion paired with groggy hangovers cannot form a coherent thought, let alone a complex escape plan involving bypassing guards, securing hidden finances, and fleeing across state lines. Her body and mind were thoroughly hijacked, synchronized entirely to the erratic, toxic schedule of her controller. The medical professionals who wrote the endless streams of prescriptions knew exactly what was happening to the minor locked inside the mansion. They saw her pupils, they saw the extreme weight fluctuations, and they understood the effects of what they were dispensing to a youth. But the organization's payroll, the intoxicating proximity to power, and the implicit threat of retaliation ensured their absolute silence. By the mid-1960s, Graceland was functioning exactly as the surveillance state was designed to function. The confined individual was visually identical to the director's desires. She was isolated from any external voice of reason. She was confined geographically, monitored auditorily, and paralyzed physiologically. She had been stripped of her face, her scent, her mobility, and her natural rhythm. She was no longer Priscilla Beaulieu, the schoolgirl from Germany. She was an entirely synthetic entity, a ghost wandering the plush carpets of an American castle, kept alive solely to validate the reflection of the man who had erased her. The enclosure was complete, and the walls were entirely soundproof. The cocktail fueling Elvis Presley's paranoid nocturnal lifestyle inevitably bred extreme, unpredictable volatility. The mansion at 3764 Elvis Presley Boulevard was a deeply unstable environment, and the king possessed a dangerous, escalating obsession with absolute dominance. Intense displays of temper were not merely occasional events. They were active, overwhelming reactions scattered across every conceivable interaction within Graceland. They were frequently directed sharply at those around him during terrifying, highly erratic mood swings. The environment Priscilla inhabited was one of constant, severe tension, a domestic zone where a wrong look, a delayed response, or a perceived slight could trigger an explosive, overwhelming outburst from a man whose stability was actively disintegrating. Elvis frequently destroyed television sets out of sheer unprovoked frustration, blasting the screens to glass shards because a singer he disliked appeared on a broadcast. This was not the quirky masculine eccentricity that the organization's public relations team would later spin to the press. It was a blatant daily demonstration of his willingness to use extreme measures when displeased. He was conditioning everyone in his orbit, especially his teenage dependent, to understand that his anger carried severe consequences. But the volatility was not always directed at inanimate objects or discharged randomly. In one of the most chilling episodes of this psychological extreme, the line between passionate possessiveness and dangerous extremes was completely erased. The psychological and aesthetic control, the auditory surveillance, and the physiological exhaustion had effectively paralyzed Priscilla. But for an individual exhibiting severe narcissistic and paranoid traits, passive compliance is never enough. They require active, terrifying proof of total submission. Behind the gilded, soundproofed doors of their bedroom, a twisted, severe loyalty test was initiated. In a manic, heavily medicated state, driven by the profound insecurities that festered beneath his global fame, Elvis confronted Priscilla. He demanded absolute, unquestioning devotion, but words were insufficient to soothe the paranoia raging in his mind. To prove his ultimate, unyielding power over her physical existence, he escalated the confrontation and directed an overwhelming level of hostility directly at her. He stood over her, exerting absolute intimidation. He wanted to see the absolute, primal submission in her eyes. He wanted to feel the intoxicating power of holding a young woman's well-being resting entirely on his actions. He interrogated her loyalty while the intense pressure weighed heavily upon her skull. This was an act of severe, calculated emotional extremity. It was a terrifying display of force designed to shatter any remaining microscopic fragment of self-worth or defiance she might have harbored deep within her consciousness. For the young woman enduring this dark moment, the message was unmistakable and permanently traumatizing. You do not belong to yourself. You belong to me, and your continued survival is entirely dependent on my momentary mercy. You cannot leave, you cannot rebel, and you cannot seek outside help, because I am the ultimate authority in this compound. To survive such a terrifying display of intimidation at the hands of an intimate partner fundamentally rewires the human brain. It induces a profound state of intense conditioning and learned helplessness. Priscilla survived the night. The tension was eventually lowered, but the psychological impact had been delivered. She was definitively broken to his will, convinced that the man who claimed to love her was entirely capable of extreme actions if she ever attempted to breach the perimeter of his control. However, the immense localized power of the Presley organization could not keep the reality of the Graceland compound completely insulated from the outside world forever. By the mid-1960s, the cultural landscape of America was shifting rapidly. The deferential, sanitized press of the 1950s was beginning to give way to a more aggressive, investigative style of journalism. The outside world was beginning to sniff around the edges of the Memphis estate. Whispers, rumors, and blind items were circulating in the tabloids and entertainment columns about the mysterious teenager living in the rock star's mansion. Journalists were starting to ask questions that the organization's standard financial arrangements and exclusive access passes could no longer easily deflect. But the threat of bad press was a secondary concern compared to the looming catastrophic public peril that the enterprise was suddenly facing. Maintaining a minor across state and international lines under highly questionable circumstances was a severe public scandal. This was not an obscure, unenforced social rule. The media had recently and highly publicly scrutinized other foundational architects of rock and roll for similar dynamics. The precedent had been aggressively set. If an ambitious, headline-hungry reporter decided to build a case against Elvis Presley, or if Priscilla's parents in West Germany suddenly snapped out of their celebrity-induced trance, realized the severity of their daughter's situation, and demanded her immediate return, the resulting scandal would obliterate the empire. It would not merely tarnish the king's family-friendly reputation. It would result in a highly publicized reckoning, severe consequences for the primary asset, and the complete instantaneous financial collapse of the multi-million-dollar Presley conglomerate. The risk had become mathematically unacceptable. The golden goose had blindly wandered into a public relations minefield, dragging the entire corporate structure behind him. This is the precise moment the organization's ultimate architect and enforcer intervened to neutralize the threat. Colonel Tom Parker was not a music manager in any traditional sense. He was a ruthless corporate fixer with a documented history of operating in the extra-legal shadows. Born Andreas Cornelis van Kuyk, Parker was a Dutch illegal immigrant who had reinvented himself in America as a carnival barker and music promoter. He operated without a passport, without a conscience, and with a singular pathological obsession with maximizing and protecting revenue streams. Parker did not care about the moral implications of a 24-year-old influencing a 14-year-old child. He did not care about the psychological pressure, the invasive surveillance, the dangerous exhaustion, or the extreme intimidation directed at a young girl. Parker cared exclusively about the balance sheet, the tax liabilities, and the contractual obligations of the Elvis brand. He surveyed the escalating, erratic, volatile behavior of his client and the looming catastrophic public liability regarding the minor living in Graceland, and he issued a boardroom ultimatum. The public liability had to be neutralized immediately and permanently. The only way to legally protect Elvis from severe social backlash, to permanently silence the probing press, and to pacify the increasingly anxious Beaulieu family was to officially legitimize the arrangement. Elvis had to marry Priscilla. It was not a romantic suggestion presented to a man in love. It was a strict corporate directive handed down by a manager desperate to secure a vulnerable asset. Parker understood the mechanics of American media and public relations perfectly. A marriage certificate would invoke immediate respectability, legally preventing Priscilla from ever being viewed as anything other than a devoted spouse. Furthermore, a wedding would instantly transform a dark narrative of an isolated teenager into the ultimate, highly marketable American fairy tale. It would launder the situation through the sacred institution of marriage. Elvis, trapped by his own vulnerabilities and entirely dependent on Parker's ruthless management of his career, capitulated to the directive. The logistical execution of the operation was initiated with military precision. The event was not planned as a celebration of a union. It was orchestrated as a covert, highly controlled public relations operation. Parker chose Las Vegas, a city built on transactional relationships and rapid legal processing, as the extraction point. On the morning of May 1st, 1967, the arrangement was officially set. The mechanics of the Las Vegas wedding are a testament to the cold, clinical efficiency of the organization. There was no romance in the itinerary. The couple was flown into the city under the cover of darkness. The marriage license was procured in the early hours of the morning to avoid public scrutiny. The ceremony itself, held in a private suite at the Aladdin Hotel, lasted exactly 8 minutes. It was a rapid, sterile recitation of vows overseen by a Nevada Supreme Court justice, ensuring the legal, ironclad nature of the contract. The guest list was aggressively restricted, populated not by extended family and lifelong friends, but by the enterprise's inner circle, the men who had facilitated the conditioning, enforced the isolation, and profited from the empire. Following the 8-minute legal transaction, the secondary phase of Parker's operation commenced, the media manipulation. A press conference had been meticulously arranged. Reporters and photographers representing the major global wire services were corralled into an adjoining room. They were not invited to investigate. They were invited to amplify. The parameters of the press conference were tightly controlled by Parker's operatives, who physically dominated the space, ensuring that no difficult, unscripted questions were hurled at the newly minted couple. The media was presented with the flawless, smiling visual evidence of the corporate narrative. They captured the images of the towering beehive, the white chiffon, the diamond ring, and the multi-tiered cake. The press, hungry for a happy ending and highly dependent on the organization for future access to the world's biggest star, swallowed the narrative whole without a single critical inquiry. They acted as the unpaid, highly effective public relations wing for a compromised enterprise. They took the visual evidence of a mandated marriage and beamed it to the front pages of thousands of newspapers and television broadcasts across the globe. They validated the arrangement, completely normalizing the bizarre, decade-long conditioning process and cementing the psychological walls permanently around Priscilla. The American public consumed the manufactured fairy tale exactly as Colonel Parker had intended. They saw the ultimate triumph of pure, faithful love. They did not see the intimidation. They did not see the hidden microphones. They did not see the handfuls of sleeping aids required to enforce compliance. The marriage certificate signed on that Las Vegas morning did not signify the beginning of a life together. It was the ultimate legally binding deed of control. It provided Elvis Presley with absolute social immunity from his past actions, secured the enterprise's profit margins for the foreseeable future, and formally legally bound a traumatized young woman to her controller, ensuring that the dark reality of Graceland remained securely locked behind the iron gates. The legal binding of the Las Vegas wedding secured the organization's immediate operational future, effectively laundering a massive liability through the sacred institution of marriage. But this heavily orchestrated public relations victory inadvertently triggered the final, most dangerous phase of Priscilla's situation. The contract had been signed to neutralize a crisis, but it failed to account for the biological consequences of the union. Exactly 9 months after the 8-minute ceremony at the Aladdin Hotel, the reality of the marriage materialized in a Memphis delivery room. On February 1st, 1968, Lisa Marie Presley was born. To the global public and the entertainment press, the arrival of an heir cemented the flawless image of the ultimate American royal family. It was a highly marketable milestone that generated massive revenue in magazine sales and revitalized public interest. To Elvis Presley, however, the biological reality of childbirth shattered the very psychological foundation of his obsession. The king suffered from a severe, almost textbook manifestation of deeply conflicted psychological views on women. This is a recognized psychological condition wherein an individual is completely incapable of maintaining romantic desire for a partner who has transitioned into motherhood. In his warped, heavily compartmentalized mind, Priscilla had been permanently stripped of the virginal schoolgirl aura that he had so painstakingly preserved, controlled, and focused on since she was 14 years old. She was no longer his untouched porcelain doll, carefully constructed to reflect his own desires. She had crossed an invisible, irreversible boundary into maternal reality, rendering her romantically obsolete in his eyes. The shift was immediate, absolute, and utterly unilateral. Elvis explicitly informed his wife that he could no longer consummate their marriage. He did not seek counseling. He did not ask for a divorce or offer her an exit strategy. He simply relegated her to a different category of managed inventory. She was abruptly transferred from the role of captive muse to that of a decorative domestic ghost haunting the upper floors of Graceland. While she was strictly confined to the nursery and the heavily surveilled living quarters in Memphis, expected to fulfill the role of the dutiful, invisible mother, Elvis flagrantly and publicly resumed his relentless wanderings. He paraded a continuous, highly visible stream of Hollywood co-stars, showgirls, and companions through his life. He moved them into his rented Hollywood estates and his Las Vegas hotel suites, flaunting his betrayals with the absolute arrogance of a man who knew his wife was trapped. But the cruelest, most suffocating aspect of this shift was the absolute refusal to grant her physical or legal freedom. She was entirely stripped of her value as an intimate partner, yet she was fiercely forbidden to leave the compound. She was a trophy that had lost its psychological shine, placed on a high shelf to gather dust, but fiercely guarded against anyone else who might ever want to claim it. The hypocrisy was total. He demanded absolute monastic fidelity from a woman he refused to touch, enforcing this isolation through the continued use of the Memphis Mafia's surveillance network. This unbearable, humiliating stasis forced a terrifying awakening within the individual. A human mind can only endure sensory deprivation and absolute rejection for so long before the survival instinct overrides the conditioning. Priscilla, pushed to the absolute edge of psychological endurance, began to quietly, desperately search for a crack in the fortress. She could not access the bank accounts, she could not speak to the press, and she could not rely on her isolated family in Germany. She had to find a micro-rebellion, a momentary sliver of autonomy that the organization might overlook. She found it in physical discipline. She began taking martial arts lessons, a hobby Elvis ironically endorsed, entirely oblivious to the psychological side effects. He viewed it as a passing fad. She utilized it as a lifeline. Karate taught her discipline, self-reliance, and the physical mechanics of self-defense. More importantly, it forced her out of the house. Through these lessons, she interacted with professionals outside the suffocating, sycophantic orbit of the Memphis Mafia. She began to experience the intoxicating, terrifying sensation of independent thought. She started to ask basic questions about her civil rights. She started to challenge the financial lockdown, pushing back against the surveillance, and demanding the fundamental right to exist without constant monitoring. For the first time in a decade, the heavily managed figure was showing critical signs of life. The organization noticed immediately. The men who managed the Presley empire, from Colonel Tom Parker down to the lowest-ranking bodyguard, did not view Priscilla's growing independence as a standard marital dispute. They viewed it as a catastrophic, imminent operational security breach. A heavily guarded, deeply knowledgeable asset was going rogue. If Priscilla decided to contact a competent attorney and formally file for divorce, the resulting legal discovery process would be a corporate disaster. A ruthless divorce lawyer would possess the subpoena power to force open the financial and medical records of Graceland. They would expose the fraudulent accounting, the offshore tax shelters, the network of unethical doctors prescribing thousands of items, the intense intimidation tactics, and the systematic decade-long mistreatment of a youth. A high-profile divorce trial would not just ruin the king's family-friendly reputation, it would unleash a wave of investigations that could end with the entire management structure facing severe consequences. The financial stakes were calculated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. In the cold arithmetic of the entertainment industry's elite fixers, a messy public divorce was an unacceptable corporate liability. A tragic accident, however, was highly profitable. In the twisted logic of crisis management, a grieving widower sells records. A tragic incident preserves the myth, eliminates the legal threat, silences the primary witness permanently, and generates a massive wave of global sympathy that can be instantly monetized. This brings the narrative to the chilling, heavily suppressed, and aggressively buried events of 1970. Priscilla, asserting a rare, hard-fought moment of defiance, had begun driving herself for short local errands. It was a massive breach of protocol, but she had fought tooth and nail for the fundamental right to simply exist behind the wheel of her own car without a guard in the passenger seat. On a seemingly ordinary afternoon, she took her heavy luxury vehicle out onto the winding, sun-baked roads outside the Graceland perimeter. The route was familiar, the weather conditions were clear, and the traffic was light. It was a false sense of security designed to lower her guard. As she approached a sharp, descending curve that required a significant reduction in velocity, she pressed her foot against the brake pedal. The pedal hit the floorboard with a hollow, useless thud. There was zero hydraulic resistance, no friction, no slowing of the tires. Panic, pure and absolute, flooded the cabin. She pumped the brakes frantically, driving her foot into the floor, but the hydraulic pressure was completely, totally gone. The heavy luxury vehicle was accelerating downhill, transforming instantly into a 2-ton, unguided mass operating at extreme speeds. The trees and embankments lining the road blurred into a solid, rapidly approaching wall of impending danger. In a split-second display of the survival instinct she had been quietly honing, Priscilla did not freeze. She wrenched the steering wheel, desperately trying to force the heavy car into a controlled spin to scrub off speed before the inevitable impact. The vehicle violently left the tarmac, tearing through the dirt, gravel and undergrowth in a deafening scream of tearing metal, collapsing suspension and shattering glass before finally slamming to a violent, jarring halt. She survived. By a margin of inches, a favorable angle of impact, and sheer blind luck, she walked away from the smoking wreckage trembling, heavily bruised, but breathing. The official narrative was drafted and deployed by the management before the dust had even settled on the asphalt. The local police arrived, took a cursory, deferential look at the scene involving the wife of the city's most powerful resident, and filed a standard, unimaginative accident report. It was instantly blamed on a sudden mechanical failure, a bit of terrible luck for the young mother. The press was fed a sanitized brief, and the incident was dismissed as a frightening but routine traffic mishap. But the men in greasy overalls who were called in to tow the mangled wreckage saw something that made their blood run cold, something the police either missed or were instructed to ignore. When the local mechanics dragged the vehicle back to the garage, hoisted it into the air on a hydraulic lift, and inspected the undercarriage to determine the cause of the failure, they did not find a burst brake line caused by standard wear and tear. They did not find a rusted pipe or a blown seal. They found a surgical cut. The essential components of the vehicle's stopping mechanism had been cleanly, deliberately, and inexplicably compromised. This requires a specific tool, a specific angle, and a specific deliberate intent. Brake lines on luxury vehicles do not cleanly slice themselves in half perpendicularly. It was not a mechanical failure. It was undeniable signs of deliberate interference. It was an orchestrated warning masquerading as a traffic accident. The mechanics whispered among themselves, recognizing the explosive nature of what they were looking at. But before any independent, formal investigation could be launched, before the police could be called back to inspect the severed lines, the Graceland security apparatus descended upon the garage. Men in dark suits carrying the implicit, terrifying threat of the Presley Empire's limitless resources arrived at the shop. The interaction was swift and absolute. Envelopes of cash were heavily distributed to compensate the mechanics for their time and their absolute permanent silence. The mangled car, the primary physical evidence of foul play, was quickly hooked back up, removed from the premises, and sent directly to a scrapyard to be immediately crushed into an unrecognizable cube of metal. The evidence was systematically destroyed, and the truth was buried beneath the crushing weight of corporate intimidation. The organization's message, however, was delivered to its intended recipient with terrifying clarity. When Priscilla learned of the mechanic's discovery before the vehicle was destroyed, the final illusion of her marriage evaporated. The realization that she was worth exponentially more gone than divorced fundamentally altered her psychology. She understood with chilling finality that she was not fighting a bad husband, an erratic individual, or an unfaithful partner. She was fighting a powerful multi-million-dollar corporate entity that viewed her continued presence as a direct existential threat to its profit margins. The 1970 crash was the definitive catalyst that turned a passive, managed individual into a highly strategic survivor. The realization that she was worth exponentially more gone than divorced forced Priscilla into a state of hypervigilance. The 1970 brake line incident was undeniable proof that Graceland was a lethal trap managed by men who viewed her life as a disposable corporate asset. She knew she could not simply walk out the front door and demand her fair share of the empire in an open court. Demanding a forensic accounting or fighting for half the assets would trigger a volatile response. The men who meticulously severed her brake lines would not hesitate to orchestrate a more permanent solution. To survive, her exit strategy had to be precise, agonizingly quiet, and financially sacrificial. She had to execute a defection, not a standard divorce. By willingly leaving the organization's money on the table, she would buy her life. The orchestrated crash failed to harm her body, but it successfully assassinated the captive child, leaving behind a woman who fully understood that escaping the king of rock and roll required outsmarting an entire enterprise. Her exit strategy required the utmost operational security. She could not confide in the staff, who were all on the payroll. She could not speak on the house telephones, which were monitored. She had to play the role of the docile, oblivious wife while silently planning an extraction. The catalyst for her final departure was her relationship with Mike Stone, the karate instructor she had met during her desperate attempts to find an identity outside the compound. Stone represented a tether to the normal civilian world, but he also represented a massive liability. When Elvis inevitably discovered the affair, the reaction was not that of a heartbroken husband, but of a figure whose territory had been breached. The response to the affair completely validates the extreme nature of the Presley organization. Elvis did not simply file for divorce citing wandering affections. Operating in a severe state of chemically induced paranoia and absolute megalomania, he actively sought to arrange the total destruction of Mike Stone's life. He approached members of the Memphis Mafia, the very men who acted as his enforcers, and demanded they secure an operative to permanently ruin the instructor. He offered significant sums of cash to have the severe retaliation carried out, demonstrating a total detachment from the rule of law. The fact that a global pop star could casually order such an extreme action from his living room, fully expecting his staff to facilitate the act, illustrates the terrifying autonomy of the Graceland operation. The directive was ultimately called off by cooler heads within the organization, who realized that a high-profile investigation would destroy the brand, but the intent was serious, real, and documented. For Priscilla, the ordered retaliation on Stone was the final confirmation that she was dealing with a ruthless enterprise. She executed her departure in late 1971 with surgical precision. She did not pack moving trucks or make a grand public exit. She quietly secured an apartment in Los Angeles and simply walked away, leaving the staggering wealth, the custom cars, and the priceless jewelry behind. She understood that she had to buy her future by willingly leaving the organization's money on the table. When the legal proceedings officially began, she instructed her attorneys not to pursue a scorched earth strategy. The divorce settlement of 1973 is a masterclass in corporate containment. In an era where a spouse of a highly successful figure could rightfully claim a massive percentage of the estate, Priscilla walked away with a shockingly minimal financial package. She accepted a one-time cash payment of just $1.5 million, a percentage of royalties from specific publishing companies, and modest child support. Compared to the hundreds of millions of dollars she had helped generate and the decade of profound psychological and medical mismanagement she had endured, it was a catastrophic financial loss. But in the context of her physical well-being, it was the price she paid for her freedom. Colonel Tom Parker and the Graceland executives were deeply relieved. They had secured a quiet, legally binding separation that kept the financial ledgers sealed and the dark secrets of the mansion out of the public record. Even the finalization of the divorce was heavily manipulated by the enterprise's public relations machine. The media was supplied with a carefully choreographed narrative of an amicable split between two people who simply grew apart due to the pressures of touring. On the day the divorce was finalized in a Santa Monica courthouse, the press captured the iconic photograph of Elvis and Priscilla walking out together holding hands. The public viewed it as a testament to their enduring, mature love. In reality, it was a final mandated performance dictated by the management to ensure the Presley brand sustained no optical damage. They held hands for the cameras, completing the final clause of the corporate operation before letting go and walking in opposite directions. Priscilla had survived the organization, but she left with a fractured identity, forced to rebuild her psychological framework from scratch after a decade of total sensory and routine control. The aftermath of her departure triggered the slow, grueling unraveling of the primary asset. Without his ultimate possession to control and obsess over, the frail psychological architecture of Elvis Presley completely collapsed. The observation environment he had built was now empty, and the silence drove him further into the abyss of intense dependency. The organization, rather than intervening to save the man who generated all their revenue, simply adapted to his deterioration. They tightened their circle, isolating him further to protect the remaining revenue streams. The network of unethical doctors, most notably Dr. George Nicopolis, escalated their medical mismanagement to astronomical levels. In the final years of his life, Elvis was prescribed tens of thousands of doses of heavy items, sedatives, and stimulants. He was a walking pharmaceutical experiment, bloated, sweating, and barely coherent on stage in Las Vegas. Yet, Colonel Parker continued to book grueling, relentless tour schedules. The management viewed Elvis not as a patient requiring immediate medical intervention, but as a failing piece of heavy machinery that needed to be kept running at maximum capacity until the engine finally seized. They propped him up, pumped him full of energy boosters to get him through a 90-minute set, and then heavily sedated him for the journey to the next city. It was the ultimate devastating exploitation of human capital. A controller without an individual to control eventually becomes a prisoner of his own fortress. On August 16, 1977, the inevitable conclusion of this decade-long descent into medical mismanagement and unchecked power arrived. Elvis Presley died on the floor of a bathroom in Graceland, his body wrecked by the very pharmaceutical tools he had once used to manage his teenage companion. There was no dignity in his end. He was merely a casualty of the organization's insatiable greed and his own pathological entitlement. Even in death, the enterprise's cover-up operation functioned with chilling efficiency. The initial autopsy reports were heavily sanitized, and the cause of death was publicly attributed to cardiac arrhythmia, deliberately obscuring the lethal levels of extreme substances in his system. The medical examiners, the local police, and the management colluded to protect the brand one last time. They knew that a fatal health collapse would shatter the wholesome image of the king, so they simply rewrote the medical facts to preserve the merchandise. The death of the primary asset did not signal the end of the enterprise. It merely marked a transition in their business model. Colonel Parker and the executives immediately scrambled to monetize the aftermath. Graceland, the site of systematic conditioning, profound psychological pressure, and a tragic incident, was rapidly converted into a lucrative tourist attraction. The organization sold tickets to the public, inviting them to walk the halls of the surveillance state, entirely unaware of the dark history soaked into the carpets. They merchandised his image, selling the illusion of a rebellious but patriotic Southern gentleman, generating more revenue in death than he ever did in life. The PR machine buried the conditioning, the intimidation, the severe control, and the severed brake lines beneath a mountain of cheap plastic souvenirs and remastered greatest hits albums. The story of Elvis and Priscilla Presley is fiercely guarded by a nostalgia industry that relies on the public's desperate need to believe in fairy tales. We are conditioned by popular culture to worship at the altar of extreme talent and limitless wealth, to view celebrities as deities who exist above the brutal realities of human behavior. But behind the sequined jumpsuits, the velvet robes, and the multi-platinum records lies a chilling, forensic testament to the banality of exploitation in the entertainment industry. It proves that when fame and capital reach the level of a sovereign state, the human beings caught in its orbit are stripped of their humanity and reduced to raw, disposable materials. Priscilla Beaulieu did not live a great American romance. She survived a heavily funded, legally protected, highly controlled environment. She endured a decade of psychological pressure, extreme lifestyle management, and a volatile dynamic orchestrated by men who wore tailored suits and smiled warmly for the cameras. Her ultimate triumph was not becoming the queen of rock and roll, nor was it inheriting the fame of the Presley name. Her true triumph was recognizing the mechanics of her own confinement, identifying the threats operating within her own home, and executing a flawless escape from the most heavily guarded throne in America. She walked away from the empire and simply managed to keep herself intact. The king is gone, and the organization's actions remain buried beneath layers of highly profitable mythology, heavily guarded by the gatekeepers of music history. But the truth of those years remains cold, unyielding, and impossible to entirely erase for those willing to look past the glare of the flashbulbs. The greatest, most sinister illusion Hollywood and the music industry ever successfully pulled was convincing the entire world that a cage is a castle, so long as the bars are made of solid gold.